Nothing collapsed, no market shut down, no currencies vanished, no emergency meetings were broadcast across global media, and that is exactly the problem. For days, the expectation has been clear. If the system was under stress, something should have broken. If pressure was real, the reaction should have been visible, but nothing happened, at least nothing obvious. And that disconnect between expectation and reality is where the real danger begins. We have been trained to recognize collapse through spectacle, through crashes, headlines, and dramatic turning points. We expect alarms. We expect panic. We expect a moment that clearly signals, this is it. But complex systems do not fail that way. They rarely collapse in public. They erode in private. What we are witnessing now is not a failure event. It is a transition phase. The structures that govern global finance, trade, and enforcement are still standing. They still operate. They still appear intact. Yet beneath that appearance, behavior has changed. Transactions are being rerouted. Decisions are being deferred. Risk is being recalculated. And none of that requires a headline. The absence of collapse is not evidence of stability. It is evidence of adaptation. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when systems adapt quietly, pressure does not disappear. It migrates. It shifts from public visibility to institutional behavior, from markets to mechanisms, from rules to workarounds. And once that shift begins, reversal becomes difficult. The system did not fail when challenged. It adjusted. And adjustment in this context is more dangerous than breakdown, because breakdown forces response. Adjustment allows delay. What we are seeing now is a world learning how to function under stress without acknowledging that stress publicly. And that is why nothing collapsing is not reassuring. It is a warning. The biggest mistake people make in moments like this is expecting collapse to look dramatic. We imagine failure as an event, a sudden break, a visible moment where everything stops working at once. That expectation comes from how crises are portrayed, not how systems actually behave. Markets condition us to look for signals that are loud, sharp movements, sudden drops, emergency announcements. But those signals usually appear late in the process, not at the beginning. By the time a collapse becomes visible, the structural damage has already occurred. This is why the absence of chaos feels confusing. If nothing exploded, if nothing crashed, then maybe nothing serious happened. That logic is flawed. Large systems are designed to absorb shock. They are built with buffers, redundancies, and fallback mechanisms precisely to prevent visible failure. When pressure increases, the first response is not collapse. It is containment. Institutions delay recognition. Markets smooth reactions. Officials manage perception. The goal is simple: keep the appearance of normalcy as long as possible. And in many cases, that strategy works. The public sees stability. Markets remain open. Headlines move on. But beneath that surface, behavior shifts. Risk tolerance tightens. Decision-making slows. Alternatives are explored quietly. This is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. People equate stability with safety. They assume that if the system is still functioning, then it is still strong. In reality, functionality and strength are not the same thing. A system can function while losing coherence. It can operate while becoming less reliable. It can continue while quietly shedding control. This is especially true in global finance and geopolitics. These systems do not fail because one actor pushes too hard. They fail when participants stop believing the rules are mandatory. And belief rarely disappears overnight. It erodes. First through exceptions, then through workarounds, then through normalization. Each step looks reasonable on its own. None of them trigger alarms, but taken together, they weaken the foundation. The expectation of a crash blinds observers to these changes. They wait for confirmation that arrives too late. They look for a single moment of truth, instead of a pattern of adjustment, and by the time that moment arrives, options are limited. This is why moments of apparent calm deserve closer attention than moments of chaos. Chaos signals reaction. Calm can signal preparation. What we are seeing now is not a system under attack. It is a system under negotiation. Negotiation does not happen publicly. It happens in routing decisions, settlement choices, and enforcement priorities. And none of that requires a crash. The absence of collapse is not proof that pressure failed. It may be proof that pressure is being redistributed. To understand why nothing collapsed, it helps to understand how systems actually fail. Failure in complex systems is rarely sudden. It is gradual, layered, and often invisible until it becomes irreversible. Most global systems are not built to break under pressure. They are built to survive it. They are designed with redundancies, exceptions, and fallback mechanisms that allow them to continue operating even when core assumptions are no longer holding. That design creates resilience, but it also creates blind spots, because a system that can continue functioning while weakening does not alert its users to danger. Instead of failing loudly, it degrades quietly. The first stage of failure is not collapse. It is distortion. Rules remain in place, but they are applied unevenly. Processes still exist, but they are bypassed selectively. Outcomes still occur, but through alternative paths. At this stage, everything appears normal from the outside. The second stage is fragmentation. Different actors begin operating under different assumptions. What was once a single framework becomes a set of parallel interpretations. One group follows the rules strictly, another follows them when convenient, a third learns how to avoid them entirely. The system still exists, but it no longer behaves as a unified whole. This is where power begins to leak. Control depends on predictability. When outcomes become inconsistent, enforcement loses credibility. The third stage is normalization. What began as an exception becomes routine. What was once risky becomes acceptable. What was once unthinkable becomes quietly tolerated. At this point, the system has not failed publicly, but it has failed functionally. Its authority no longer comes from rules, it comes from habit, and habits change faster than laws. This is why dramatic collapses are rare. By the time a system reaches the point of visible failure, most participants have already adapted. They have already adjusted behavior. They have already reduced exposure. They have already prepared alternatives. When collapse finally occurs, it feels sudden. But in reality, it has been unfolding for years. What makes the current moment important is that we are witnessing early-stage failure indicators. Not crashes, not panic, but distortion and fragmentation. Processes are still running, markets are still open, enforcement still exists on paper, but alignment is weakening. Different actors are no longer responding to the same incentives. They are no longer constrained by the same limits. That divergence is subtle, but it is structural, and once divergence sets in, restoring coherence becomes extremely difficult. Because restoring coherence requires more than rules. It requires belief. Belief that the system is still the only viable option. What we are seeing now is the early erosion of that belief, not through confrontation, but through quiet adaptation. What makes this phase difficult to understand is that most of the change did not announce itself. There were no emergency statements, no sudden policy reversals, no visible breakdown of institutions. Instead, change appeared in behavior. The first shift happened in decision-making. Institutions became more cautious, not more aggressive. Approvals took longer. Exposure limits tightened quietly. Risk committees began asking different questions, not whether something was allowed, but whether it was necessary. This is a subtle but critical distinction. When systems are strong, participants optimize for efficiency. When systems are stressed, they optimize for flexibility. That shift does not make headlines, but it changes outcomes. The second shift appeared in routing. Transactions did not stop. They changed paths. Settlement choices became more diverse. Intermediaries multiplied. Fallback options that once existed only as contingencies began to see real use. None of this violates rules directly, but it reduces dependence. The third shift occurred in enforcement behavior. Rules were still cited, frameworks were still referenced, but enforcement became more selective. Not every violation was pursued, not every exception was challenged. Priorities narrowed. This is not necessarily a sign of weakness. It is often a sign of capacity management. But capacity management has consequences. When enforcement becomes selective, credibility becomes conditional. Actors begin to test boundaries, not aggressively, but incrementally. They do not ask for permission. They observe reaction. And when reaction is limited or delayed, confidence grows. Another quiet change appeared in language. Official communication became more ambiguous. Statements emphasized stability rather than control, resilience rather than dominance. This is not accidental. Language reflects internal assessment. When confidence is high, language is firm. When confidence weakens, language becomes flexible. The final shift is perhaps the most important. Expectation management. Markets, institutions, and governments began adjusting expectations downward without acknowledging it openly. Targets became ranges. Timelines became estimates. Commitments became intentions. This does not indicate collapse. It indicates uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior faster than fear. What connects all these changes is that they do not require coordination. No central authority needs to declare them. They emerge organically as participants respond to the same pressure. That is why they are difficult to reverse. You cannot undo behavior shifts with announcements. You cannot restore confidence with reassurance alone. Once actors begin acting as if alternatives are necessary, those alternatives gain legitimacy. This is what makes the absence of headlines misleading. The lack of visible crisis suggests continuity. But continuity of appearance does not mean continuity of structure. What changed without headlines was not the system itself. It was how the system is being used, and that distinction explains why nothing collapsed, yet everything feels different. A crisis forces a response. That is what makes it manageable. When systems break publicly, reaction is immediate. Authorities intervene, markets reprice, rules are rewritten under pressure, crises compress time. They force decisions that would otherwise be delayed. They clarify priorities. They expose weaknesses quickly. What we are experiencing now is the opposite. There is no urgency forcing resolution, no single moment demanding action, no clear trigger that compels alignment. Instead, there is drift. Drift is more dangerous than crisis because it feels survivable. Participants adapt just enough to function. Institutions adjust just enough to continue. Markets recalibrate just enough to avoid panic. But none of these adjustments solve the underlying tension. They manage it. And management without resolution creates accumulation. Pressure does not disappear. It spreads. It moves from visible stress to structural imbalance. This is why slow erosion is harder to confront than sudden collapse. Collapse creates accountability. Erosion creates ambiguity. In ambiguous environments, responsibility diffuses. No single actor feels compelled to act. No single institution owns the problem. No single event justifies decisive intervention. Everyone waits. This waiting period is where systems lose coherence. Rules become guidelines. Guidelines become suggestions. Suggestions become optional. Each step appears rational in isolation. No one believes they are weakening the system. They believe they are navigating it. But navigation without coordination leads to divergence. Different actors move in different directions, not because they intend to break the system, but because they no longer trust it to hold. This is the core danger. Trust is not binary. It does not vanish overnight. It degrades incrementally. And once trust drops below a certain threshold, restoring it becomes exponentially harder. Crises can rebuild trust through action. Drift undermines trust through inaction. This is why the absence of collapse should not be reassuring. It means the system is absorbing stress without confronting it. It means the cost of delay appears lower than the cost of decision, and that calculation is unstable. Eventually, accumulated pressure forces adjustment anyway, but by then, options are narrower, trade-offs are harsher, and coordination is weaker. This is why moments of slow transition are often remembered as calm right before they are remembered as decisive. At the time, nothing seemed urgent. In retrospect, everything was already changing. What makes this phase particularly risky is that it rewards short-term stability over long-term integrity. The system continues, but it continues in a weakened state. And weakened systems do not fail dramatically. They fail asymmetrically. Some actors adapt early and gain flexibility. Others adapt late and lose leverage. That uneven adjustment is where lasting shifts in power occur. What makes this moment especially important is that it is not being misunderstood everywhere. While public attention remains fixed on visible indicators, many actors have already adjusted their expectations, not publicly, not rhetorically, but operationally. Governments are reassessing exposure without announcing policy shifts. Institutions are reviewing dependencies without issuing statements. Markets are incorporating uncertainty without dramatic repricing. This is not coordination. It is convergence. Different actors are reaching similar conclusions independently. That convergence matters more than declarations, because when multiple participants begin acting as if the system is less reliable, the system becomes less reliable. This feedback loop does not require agreement. It only requires shared observation. One of the clearest signs of this understanding is restraint. There has been no rush to escalate, no urgency to assert dominance, no dramatic effort to reimpose control. That absence is not accidental. Escalation would expose limits, force would invite resistance, visibility would accelerate adaptation. Instead, the response has been measured. Systems are being watched, not challenged. Boundaries are being tested quietly, not publicly. This is how power behaves when it recognizes constraint. Another sign is diversification. Exposure is being spread. Dependencies are being reduced incrementally. Fallback options are being treated as viable, not hypothetical. None of this signals abandonment, it signals hedging. And hedging at scale reshapes systems. When enough actors hedge simultaneously, exclusivity erodes. No single framework disappears, but no single framework remains dominant. This is not fragmentation through conflict. It is fragmentation through precaution, and precaution is difficult to reverse. Once alternatives are integrated into routine planning, removing them feels like unnecessary risk. The world does not need to declare that it understands what is happening. Understanding is visible in behavior. It appears in how contracts are written, how timelines are structured, how enforcement risk is priced. These signals do not trend on social media. They do not generate headlines, but they shape outcomes. What is happening now is not a revolt against the system. It is a recalibration of trust. Trust is being redistributed, not withdrawn entirely, and redistribution changes leverage. Those who adapt early gain optionality. Those who adapt late face constraints. This is why moments like this are rarely obvious in real time. They are recognized later when patterns become permanent. Right now, the world is not reacting. It is learning. What we are witnessing is not the end of a system. It is the exposure of its limits. For a long time, stability was assumed to be permanent. Rules were treated as fixed. Enforcement was seen as automatic. That assumption is now being tested, not through confrontation, not through collapse, but through quiet adjustment. Nothing collapsed because collapse was not necessary. The system absorbed pressure by allowing behavior to change without forcing acknowledgement. That strategy works in the short term. It buys time. It preserves appearances. But it comes at a cost. Every adjustment that avoids confrontation also avoids resolution. Every workaround that preserves function weakens authority. Every exception that becomes routine erodes trust. Over time, these costs accumulate, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally. This is why the absence of crisis should not be mistaken for safety. It is a sign that pressure is being managed, not removed. And managed pressure does not disappear, it redistributes. What happens next does not depend on a single decision or a single event. It depends on whether trust can be reasserted before adaptation becomes permanent. Once adaptation hardens into habit, reversal becomes difficult. Systems can be repaired after crisis. They are harder to repair after drift. Because drift does not create a moment of reckoning. It creates a new normal. That is the real warning here. The danger is not that everything breaks. It is that everything continues, just differently. And difference, when normalized, becomes reality. The system did not collapse, but it changed. And change without acknowledgement is the most powerful kind. Because once it is fully understood, it is already complete.